and also just general questions I have about physiology. Obviously, the morphology side is perfectly intuitive because you can just see what the bones look like and everything. But more generally, how does one make inferences about dinosaur physiology?
So this comes down to a number of different proxies. So one of the most commonly used ones comes down to looking at dinosaur growth rates, and then generally making the assumption that if an animal grows quickly, it was probably able to fuel its body and was living actively and possibly with a high metabolic rate. So this is probably the method that's used most often. And we can get an idea of growth rates in a relatively simple way. And that is by cutting open a dinosaur bone. And bone forms cyclically in response to environmental changes. So during a good season, the bone grows quickly. During a poor season, it grows slowly. And those alternating patterns of growth, which are normally annual, lay down rings of fast growth versus narrow rings of slow growth, and so on in this cyclical pattern. So when we cut open that dinosaur bone, it's simply a case of counting the rings to work out how old the animal was at the time it died. And then we can use various other things like the circumference of the animal's leg bones to get an idea of how much it weighed, because that's a physical feature related to its body mass, which we see in living animals too. And by combining those two things, we can then get a rate of growth. And it turns out that dinosaurs grew much faster than any other reptile that we know about, much faster. Some of them growing at rates that are definitely comparable with those of living mammals. And none of them grow as fast as birds grow faster than almost anything. But then again, birds are living dinosaurs, so perhaps I'm not comparing like we like. But certainly they grew very fast, much faster than a crocodile or a turtle or a lizard or anything like that. And so if you find even an isolated bit of a dinosaur bone that shows those growth rings, even if you only have a chip of that bone that you don't know if it's from a dinosaur or not, if it's of that age and it was growing that quickly, you've probably got a bit of dinosaur in your hand.
Interesting. So you can infer how fast they were growing by looking at the bones. It's not on like a tree ring or something. And this tells you something about their metabolism. And for me, naturally, this brings up the question of something like warm-blooded versus cold-bloodedness. And, I remember vaguely hearing at some point that maybe some or even many dinosaurs were warm-blooded. And I'm wondering if the answer to that question is right at about this spot.
Yeah, I think going back historically, dinosaurs were just viewed as scaled-up lizards. So it was assumed that for most of the history of dinosaur studies through at least the 1970s, that these were largely kind of large, sluggish, basically scaled-up iguanas. But a large number of studies since then have tended to overturn that rule, and most people would now regard dinosaurs as having an elevated metabolic rate in comparison with reptiles, although there is still a debate over how elevated that rate would be and how they achieved those higher body temperatures and higher metabolisms. So, for example, the really gigantic dinosaurs probably didn't have mammal-style warm-bloodedness, because they would probably end up overheating if they did. These are huge animals that would be making a huge amount of internal heat that they would have to dump somehow in order to avoid overheat. And also it would require vast amounts of fuel to keep those kinds of bodies going. But equally, if you're very large, you can keep heat internally very relatively easy. So as you digest food, you produce heat. As you move around, your muscles produce heat as a waste product. And all of those things added together produce something that's been called by some people inertial homeothermy. And that is basically maintaining a constant high body temperature simply by the fact that you lose your internally generated heat quite slowly, even if your metabolic furnace is set, the thermostat's not particularly high, because you're making all this other heat simply by moving around and digesting things. And that heat is difficult to get rid of. Maybe you end up with a higher constant temperature. But for smaller dinosaurs, there's a slightly more of a consensus that those animals may have actually flicked the switch and genuinely have been generating heat internally and not just relying on external sources of heat or sources of heat generated through bodily processes. So it seems more likely that these small animals that are very lightly built, they look like they're built for an active life. Some of them have quite large brains, and large brains also demand quite a lot of fuel to keep them running. So dinosaurs might have actually occupied a spectrum of body temperatures and ways of maintaining those body temperatures, which might not be too surprising. I mean, we think of mammals as warm-blooded, but some mammals run on a very low thermostat, things like sloths. Almost picking up, almost doing nothing in terms of their metabolic rate. They're relying a lot on external heat. They're not particularly active. Whereas other animals that we think of, like mice, obviously are running on a very high thermostat, running around constantly using up energy. So it might not be that surprising that when you have a range of animals that range in size and range in behavior, that maybe they have some different strategies. The one thing I think we all agree on is that dinosaurs are all running warmer on average, and probably keeping those temperatures constant, unlike things like crocodiles and turtles and lizards today.
So as a general rule, metabolic growth rates were higher for dinosaurs than living reptiles. So somehow their metabolism and their physiology had to support that. You also mentioned something that I wanted to get to, which is many of them had large brains. And, it's very interesting to think about things like what the cognition of some of these animals would have looked like, if only because they were around for, more than enough time to evolve sophisticated cognition, potentially. I suppose the reality that you're anchored to here is in looking at things like skull volume and brain skull to body size ratios and things like that. What were some of the more impressive dinosaurs looking like in those terms?
That's exactly right. So we're reliant entirely on those kinds of measures when we're coming up with our ideas about how smart a dinosaur might be. So a lot of dinosaurs, frankly, are not very smart. They have brains that are about the right size for their body size, and they're not that much different from the kinds of relationship we'd see in a living reptile like a crocodile or a turtle. But there are a small number of dinosaurs that are on their way to being birds that do substantially increase their brain size. And in particular, there's a few things that are very close to bird origins, animals called paravians, that include, for example, things like Troodon, and to some extent things like Velociraptor, where their brains are larger than we would expect for their body size, which suggests that these are animals that might be doing something different cognitively to the other bigger animals that are largely just using those brains to find other dinosaurs, avoid being eaten, and making other little dinosaurs. So these are animals that potentially might have been capable of slightly more sophisticated behaviors, for example.
I see. So they deviate somewhat in their brain to body ratio from other dinosaurs, but there's not some species that's like off the charts.
No, we're not looking at any that are. We don't have dinosaurs, extinct dinosaurs that we think of as things like dolphins. But of course, when we bring birds into the mix, we do start to get contenders for really smart animals that are convergently achieving, in some cases, mammal-like levels of cognition and ability in terms of things like tool use and memory. So things like corvids, for example, crows, are well-documented tool users. They are also proven to have good spatial memory and problem-solving abilities. Parrots also known to exhibit some of those tendencies. So dinosaurs did get there. It's just that it had to wait until birds for that intelligence, if you like, to really take off. Pardon pun, because obviously they're flying as well. But it is interesting that we do get that convergent evolution of those enhanced cognitive abilities in those two great groups, mammals and dinosaurs. And they often end up being used for the same thing in tool use and social communication and all these kinds of things. So, but if you're looking at a crow, you're looking at probably the smartest dinosaur that ever lived.
So you did mention there velociraptors and some of those related species. Now, as I'm sure you have seen, the popular depiction of the velociraptor in the movies was A, it was a predator, obviously, but B, it was highly intelligent, and C, it was social. So they hunted in packs. The last question is probably answerable in principle, right? Were there any velociraptors or predatory dinosaurs that were social and potentially pack hunters like that?
It's been suggested they were. The evidence is a little bit equivocal. So part of the evidence comes from finding groups of these things fossilized together. So there are a couple of examples of meat-eating dinosaurs found in small groups that are interpreted as packs that were wiped out in a single event. So that's one line of evidence. Another line of evidence comes from looking in the opposite direction at kills. So at herbivore skeletons that have evidence that they have been predated by more than one individual because, say, there are teeth of different sizes left at the kill site. So that's the flip version of that. And the third part of that argument would be footprints, because there are, again, some examples of footprints of meat-eating dinosaurs apparently walking in the same place together at the same time. And the final part of that would be, again, this idea about increased cognition that you might expect in an animal that's having to coordinate activity as a group. And that goes along with things like these small meat-eating dinosaurs having bigger brains than we might expect for animals of their size.